Just a quick 2022 stats because we are winding the year down. Oh, basically, in 2023 now they're predicting 10.5 trillion dollars in 10.5 US dollars to inflict global damage. So I mean the cost of a breach is around the world is going to be 10.5 trillion US dollars. I mean that number has risen in the last few years that I've been doing this as well. 52% of the data breaches are due to employee errors. So I think security awareness is a major thing. We need to talk about seminars like this, webinars like this, more and more, and allow your employees to attend it as well. 47% of small businesses have fallen victim this year to some sort of cyber attack, and then 67% will experience more than once. Because Richard, you know this more better than anyone else. Once you have a breach, the chances are that they're coming back for you again, right? Like, there's no honor amongst thieves, right? So, it's not like they're going to leave you alone, but they're coming back.
Exactly, and especially those who pay out the ransom. What better customer to bring back than a paying customer, right? So
That's
when
right.
a lot of the ransomware operators, they know the ones who pay them, and then you go back to those. That's why start to see things like re-encryption events or triple extortion, or just really crazy kind of things that are the outcomes of those type of repeat kind of
That's right. And
engagements.
it's like having a loyal customer, right? That always comes back, right?
Yeah,
Uh, 80% increase in phishing since March 2020. It's just mind-boggling to me that we keep talking about phishing over and over again. And that's the number one threat vector for the entire industry, where it's just about phishing. Like, yeah, there's brute forces and things like that, but it's always something to do with phishing that pops up, right? And that's the easiest way to get in. And again, that goes back to employer.
yeah. And the thing about smishing, I like SMS phishing.
Right.
That is, I don't know about you, but I get tons of those every single day. I'm getting an email saying it's from Canada Post, and you need to make sure that you're responding to them to pay the duty on the package. And everybody at the holidays are like, "Well, I'm expecting a package," so they click on the link, and SMS phishing ends up being an incredible vector because it's so immediate, it's so quick, it's right in your hand.
Especially right now when there's a whole supply chain constraint going on, right? The issue with SMS is huge because people are waiting for packages sometimes for days or months because there is a shortage, right? Again, $3.86 million is the average recovery cost for an organization that's been breached. And I think it used to be 1.5 when I started doing this, and it keeps going up and up just because of the impact that it has these days. Everything is online, everything is electronic, and it takes 280 days to identify a breach, right? Sometimes even more. And we're going to talk about one such breaches that took much longer to even identify, but it always comes to mind when that movie with Seth Rogen and James Franco came out, which was a parody about the Korean dictator. The Koreans were in Sony's infrastructure for over a year before they launched an attack just before the movie came out. Right? It's like 280 days is just mind-boggling. All right, here's some hacking stats. 39 seconds, there's an attack every 39 seconds somewhere in the world, right? It's again crazy stats. Russians are the fastest at hacking a computer. I mean, this is not against Russians, but basically at the end of the day, a lot of it is state sponsored. We know that, and especially with the war that's going on, a lot of these ransoms are being funded towards that. So it definitely is something that we got to keep in mind. Geo blocking and things are something that we should be all considering from a protection perspective, right? 560,000 malwares are detected every day. Like, if you just look at the stats, even IBM X-Force Exchange, you will see the botnets going off like left, right, and center on their dashboard, right? And cybercrime is more profitable than illegal drug trade. It's crazy. 75 records are stolen per second, and then 3.5 million cybersecurity jobs will be open in 2025. I think it's a good industry to be in for all of us. Everyone that joined, due to the interest in cybersecurity. I think hopefully this is going to be a lucrative industry for a lot of people because there's such a shortage, right? We can't find enough people. I know that, Richard, you have job openings almost every month, and it takes you a long time to fill those jobs because it's such a competitive market, right?
Definitely,
Yeah.
yeah.
All right. So moving on, holiday ghosts, our
Perfect.
theme for
Yeah,
today. So,
perfect. Yeah. So, why holiday ghosts? What we often call this season, this is kind of like what we call breach season in the industry. It's that peak period from Black Friday all the way through to mid, almost end of January, where we see the increased amount of attacks. There's an insane amount of fraud that, Black Friday is the highest amount of fraud of any day of the year. And then we start to see cyber attacks really ramp up from that point. Think
yeah,
about, your credit card if it gets stolen. Well, a lot of people are making transactions over the holidays. So is this me, you, someone else who made
right.
this transaction? So there's a lot of, period where we're spending a lot of money and not looking at our statements and that sort of thing. So there's creates a lot of opportunity for attackers. But specific to the corporate world, what we often see is that we see a lot of increase in business email compromise. So this is over phishing or vishing. Someone calls you, I'm an executive at your organization. I need you to go and buy 18 gift cards, or we need to do a wire transfer to this location, or this customer never got paid, or you can kind of look at kind of from both sides. They always come up
Absolutely.
with different scenarios and trying to find ways to move money. And we can talk about a couple scenarios of past experiences of how this has shown up. Ransomware is definitely elevated during the holidays.
Yes.
Operators, they realize during the holiday period we have a skeleton crew, or some organizations have more of a skeleton crew where they have less people working because
Right.
staff takes holidays and that sort of thing. And this creates an opportunity. It takes a bit longer to connect with somebody over the phone because they're out of the office and you need to pick up the phone and jump on, and it just takes a bit more time to coordinate some
Right.
of these activities. And sometimes it's through initial access would be through phishing, so an email that looks legitimate, that's not a brute force attack, which we'll talk about. Or sometimes they don't even need to acquire the credentials themselves. They'll actually just buy them on the dark web.
Right.
So a lot of what's called an initial access broker is a role that an actor would have, where they would go in and try and find credentials for different organizations, so VPN, firewalls, a whole bunch of other assets. And then what they'll do is they'll itemize them in a list and they'll sell them on the dark web.
Right.
So someone can buy credentials to access a specific corporate network for say $1,000 to $5,000. So rather than worrying about phishing and getting caught and running up against ATP, they would just easily be able to buy the credentials if they're already
Right.
available. So that creates an opportunity. And then of course, exploits. We're starting to see that, Citrix just had a bad day and there was another vulnerability released. Fortinet just had another bad day. A lot of these different firewall and kind of edge devices are starting to have a lot more vulnerabilities that are exposed, which
Right.
creates a lot of opportunities for these attackers. And then, of course, we also have the nation state. And we have a war going on in Ukraine right now, and we also have a lot of turmoil in quite a number of other countries. And a lot of the other countries that have these things going on, they have very high cyber capabilities. So you think about like compromising different organizations or individuals for some purpose or something that's going on. So there's a lot of kind of increased attacks there. And like to your point, Amal, and when we see a lot of activity in Russia and a lot of the ransomware campaigns that happen, I can't help but think that some of that is funding the war in Ukraine.
Of course.
So
Yeah.
kind of the world that we live in right now. And why? Why are we seeing a lot of increased attacks? People are festive.
Yeah.
They have their guards down. Everybody's looking for an email from someone else. Everybody's sending out greetings and sending out gift cards. And I know
Absolutely.
there's sales offers. There's Black Friday, Cyber Monday. There's all of these emails we're getting, and a lot of them we just blindly trust. So we
Right.
really have to keep our guards up during the
Yeah.
holidays instead of lowering them down.
And it's hard. It's hard because like you're so busy and you get a text message and you're like, okay, well, I don't know who, like, you kind of skim through it and you just click on it, right? And it's bound to happen. It just I think more and more awareness is where things are going to change though, right? But you want to talk about brute force attacks a little bit. I know that this is still other than phishing, this is still probably the second most attack that we see around the holiday season. And then after this, we'll get into some stories about the breaches that we have worked on and the ones that have been public.
Yep. So for brute force attack, I wanted to kind of talk to this from the attacker's perspective. Because a lot of times your credentials get compromised and you're like, how in the world did they get into my account? But it's not always as, like a crazy, it's not like they individually went through and targeted you as a user. It's more, how did they do that? So there's different types of brute force attacks, and we'll get into those. But if you think about the opportunity, there's a public data breach called LinkedIn as just an example that happened a while back. But the minute that the password database for all of those users gets leaked onto the internet, well, a lot of actors will take that list and use those password lists as those are all the passwords that people have historically had. Therefore, if we do what's called password profiling, so if your password was horrible and it was welcome one or summer 2020, spring 2021, and all of the different types of passwords, people are going to be able to guess those, and they'll build word lists based on those. Hashes are kind of a way to encode passwords. So when they're stored on the file system, you can't reverse them. You can't look at a hash and be able to say, okay, that's the password. You can't just reverse it. It's a one-way hash. So basically, in order to figure out what the password actually is, you have to pre-compute a bunch of hashes to figure out what is the plain text that goes in to have the output of being this hash. So it requires a lot of brute force, and I'll get into a bit more about that stuff, but I just want to answer Anwar's question. So the different types of brute force attacks that we commonly see and we commonly implement on our pen tests are credential stuffing. So think about the LinkedIn breach, go through, you found Amal's password there, his login and his password. Well, you take that login and a password and you try to log into his Hotmail or his Gmail or any of the other accounts. That's called stuffing. So you're basically taking the credential from a prior data breach and stuffing into a bunch of login forms. That's where we saw, Canadian Tire had that issue where, there was a data breach on one side and all of a sudden a whole bunch of accounts got compromised and everybody was pointing the finger saying that Canadian Tire was compromised, but in reality, it was someone who was abusing a word list or a prior data breach. There's also credential spraying. So think of like very common passwords that we find. And the way attackers build these is they'll take, say, a known data breach list. So say LinkedIn, just to always keep pointing back at them. You have a long list of passwords, and what they can do is statistical analysis to say how often does the password welcome one appear, or what are the top 10 passwords that people are choosing. So password one, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, QWERTYUO. Yeah, like people use keyboard tricks and different things, and the passwords end up being quite common. So what the attackers will do is they'll say, okay, these are the top 10 passwords. So let's try 2 passwords. Well, let's try them on a whole bunch of different accounts. And sometimes what happens is the frequency that people use these passwords, because they're very common, is quite high. So you end up getting into, say, if you were to spray 100 accounts, you may get into 8 accounts or 10 accounts. And sometimes we found organizations where it's upwards of 30% of the passwords are based on a very common password. So it's really, really key to have a great password policy and to make sure that those passwords are set properly. When we're brute forcing, you can start with a dictionary. So think of like your Webster's dictionary. You go through every single word and you type it up in a word list. You wouldn't do that. You would just download it. But you could use that as a mechanism to say, let's try and figure out what Amal's password is. Let's go through that entire dictionary and see. Maybe his password is 100% not going to be in that dictionary. But what attackers will then do is they'll say, well, let's add on rules to that. Because sometimes what people will do is they'll say, okay, my password is horrible. It's Apple. And then let's add on some rules. Well, maybe the rule would be the year, or maybe it's an exclamation mark or exclamation mark at symbol. People have certain behaviors where they'll use certain prefixes and suffixes to their passwords to make them seem more complex, but they'll have a base dictionary word in their password. And this is a very terrible practice. So this is how attackers are really trying to figure out what your password is. They're starting from something.
And what's online? Online and offline attacks. What do you mean by that, really quickly?
Exactly. So online attacks are where you're attacking a service that's online. It's pretty simple. So say you're trying to log into Office 365, you'd have to do that multiple times. And it's very slow, and Office 365 is aware, and they'll lock you out. Certain services don't have rate limiting or don't have the ability to detect brute force. So think of you're logging in as a local administrator on a Windows box. There's no mechanisms to disable the local admin. You could try a whole bunch of different passwords, maybe 1,000, 2,000, 5,000, whatever it is, to see if you can get into that. You can
get into them.
Okay. Now, online attacks are very slow, but when you're able to retrieve the hash of the password, so whatever is stored in the database or in an archive, you can crack those much quicker. So you can leverage things like an actual graphics card, a GPU, or a GPU rig with like 8, 10 graphics cards, which we do. Those are incredibly fast. We're talking millions, if not, tens of millions of passwords a minute. Like they're ripping through passwords very fast. We have a password list of over top 2 billion passwords that we're running through on our engagements. We're leveraging a GPU rig to go in and do those, those attempts. So really the quick and easy is that if your password gets leaked on the internet, generally it would be either, hopefully not plain text, but it'll be in a hash format.
Right.
Hash passwords can be cracked offline. Offline is fast.
Right.
If your password is online, you have rate limiting, you have brute force, so it becomes a lot harder. So when your passwords get leaked onto the internet through any data breach for any services that you have, make sure you don't have the same password everywhere, because someone's going to try and crack that password eventually.
Right.
So
Makes
this is
sense.
really why your password has to be strong.
I mean, so using these attacks, I think we're going to be talking about some stories here, in the next few slides. And just in the interest of time, I'm going to try and breeze through some of these. And Richard, you're going to have a couple as well, right? So, the ghost of RDP, December 2019. So around 2018, 2019, RDP protocol 3389 was deemed vulnerable, right? We had a client at that point that basically had an open RDP port. But it wasn't just a open RDP port. It was natted to, obviously natted to an internal server. But whoever did that was, it was smart. And you see this all the time. They didn't just open port 3389, they masked it, right? So they, instead of using port 3389, they use like a random port, 157, whatever, right? But what that still does is, the protocol is still open, but it's on a very different port, right? So then when the attackers scanned their firewalls, they found out that this new port was open, and it happened to be, redirecting to a server that was RDP. They brute forced the password in using one of the techniques that you talked about earlier. They jumped onto this server, and then within a couple of days, because we had logs of how things progressed at that point, within a couple of days, they started making lateral movements. Now, using an open port 3389 or even masking it for an out of band management is not a uncommon practice. It's a bad practice, but there's so many people that are still doing it because there's, rather than putting an out of band solution, they just use this as a quick, way of getting into the infrastructure, right? And basically once they got in, they were laterally moving and dropped ransomwares on every server while they were encrypting the files, right? And while they were encrypting and finally they ended up compromising the Active Directory. Moral of the story: never expose your RDP port, right? If you do need to expose it, you should have an IP address from which this port is accessed from, and then use strong passwords and or use EDR solutions that can actually detect lateral movements. I mean, we have EDR solutions that we deploy where it actually will say, hey, Cobalt Strike was detected, or Bloodhound was detected. Like, all these techniques need to be, your EDR solution needs to be aware of all these techniques.
So this happens very often. This is like a vanilla business email compromise. Someone gets compromised, and what happens is the attackers try to make it a lot more difficult to figure out who's behind the attack. So what they often do is they'll compromise one email address, and they'll say, okay, you're getting purchase orders from customers, and those customers are going to be paying you invoices. So what they'll do is they'll create an email account from the for the customer side and send in a fake invoice that then gets paid. So they find a lot of those opportunities where it's people aren't necessarily watching. And in this example, it was a 240,000 US dollar wire transfer that was done.
Yeah.
And it's creating that opportunity for the attackers, and they don't immediately get into the account and strike immediately. It's a lot of this, get in, wait, watch, look, check, and make sure they do their homework.
Yep.
It's not like a point and shoot kind of thing. They get in and they're watching and they're waiting. So it's making sure that they see the right opportunity and pulling the trigger when they do see that perfect opportunity.
That's
Customer's
right.
about to say, where should the payment go? They delete the email of from that user, and they send in an email saying this is where the payment should go, and they
That's
give you
right.
the wire transfer information. So it becomes
And the
so
crazy
much
part
harder to
about
find.
it was that the way that email was crafted when we analyzed it was the language, the tone, the thing was they studied the tone
Yeah,
of the real person.
definitely.
The signatures were the same, right? Even the domain name was literally a character up off. Like, it was so difficult for an unsuspecting, cybersecurity aware user to even catch it, right? It's
Yeah,
really like, unfortunately, the employees get into a lot of trouble for that. But I think the onus is on the organization to train them about such things, right?
definitely.
Sachin, you mentioned that password protection policy to ban specific words. absolutely, it needs to be used because
Definitely.
you need to have a better password control and identity access management policies to ensure that this doesn't happen. Log4j. I mean, this basically turned December 2021 upside down. Like everyone was talking about it.
I don't know what it is. It's like every December we've got something monumental. Like we in 2020 we had solar winds, in 2021 we had Log4j. I don't even want to guess what's coming this
Yeah,
year, but Log4j, why it was an issue is that Log4j is a component that's used in so many applications. It's not just used in one application. It's not just a Log4j application. It's a component that's used in quite a number of platforms. But the vulnerability that was discovered leads to remote code execution, and
right,
it's very trivial to exploit. When we find these on engagements, it's about finding a Java application that will be leveraging the Log4j component that is vulnerable to this. And if you think about how we patch most systems, whether Linux or Windows, we're looking to enumerate missing patches and then we're deploying them with a solution. These are applications that are being supported by developers. So it's really about understanding the code that you have on your platform and the
right,
components that are being leveraged. So really being intimately aware of the components that are there. And it's not as easy to know that you're vulnerable to this. Some of this
right.
is a lot of discovery work, a lot of searching your code and looking for vulnerable versions, but there's no like quick hit to find everything. It's going to require some manual efforts, a bit more tricky to find. And the moral story here is that security is really everyone's responsibility.
Yeah,
The application teams need to have support from the vulnerability management teams, because the developers can't just run everything on their own. They definitely need support. You need to
absolutely.
almost have an itemized list to say, these are all the components that I'm using in my platform, and then be aware of that. And then the vulnerability team needs to advise on, okay, here, Log4j, vulnerability is out.
Right.
So to really help them make sure they're aware of what needs to be
Exactly.
patched. Yeah.
Exactly. Someone described Log4j to me as, you're sitting inside a car, all your doors and windows are rolled up and locked, right? And then someone's shouting commands for your car to execute with everything locked up, right? Like, so, it was such a scary thing for many organizations because they just didn't know where things were coming from for them. So we touched upon on solar winds a little bit, right? You mentioned that December 2020 was the solar flare year. This is a very, very interesting one. The reason why this is interesting is because what had happened was in September 2019, the threat actors gained access to SolarWinds internal network, right? At that point we didn't know what they got it through, right? But as the year progressed, we found out more and more about it. The threat actors tested the initial code injection into Orion platform, and then the malicious code named Sunburst was injected into Orion. Unbeknownst to SolarWinds, they basically took that patch and deployed it to all the users because all these agents are connected, and it literally went out to 30,000 organizations, right? And then once they were in there, FireEye finally released a report because FireEye thought that they were getting breached, and then they realized what was happening. At first they were like, "Oh my God, we were breached," and then literally a day later, they released saying, "Oh, okay, this came from a supply chain style an attack." So what the investigation led to was in 2018, there was a GitHub repository that had a password of SolarWinds 123. Like we just talked about password audits, right? That this issue was addressed in 2019, but it was too late. In September, they had already gotten access to it. What makes this malware interesting was it laid dormant for almost two weeks. You know, and if it detected that it was in a sandbox, it would not deploy. If it basically detected there were some ATP tools, EDR tools, or code scanners were installed, it would not deploy. Right? Antiviruses fell short because it was in a legitimate DLL file, and the size of the file was under the AV DLL scanning thresholds, because some of the AVs kind of whitelist these DLLs because otherwise it would slow down your compilers and programs and things like that, right? And then they also use the same channel to dial back to exfiltrate the data that SolarWinds was using. So the firewalls didn't notice anything weird as well happening, right? Really, moral of the story: you got to perform some password audits, right? These days, 8-character complex passwords I don't think are secure anymore. 16 to 20 people are talking about, right? It has to be a phrase that has a better entropy than complexity, right? As they say, supply chain attacks are becoming common. So really, you need to hold your vendor responsible, right? Ask them for when was the last time they did a third party assurance. When did they do a vulnerability scan for their code, and ensure that you're buying from people that have a decent security record. Invest in attack surface reduction products like Microsoft Endpoint Defender. What do you think, Richard? Like, what more do you think could people do here to better secure themselves from supply chain attacks?
I look at this as like, how do you prevent yourself from the next SolarWinds? And I don't know if there's really an answer to that, because SolarWinds was so complex and it was at a level that we've never seen before. So really the supply chain thing is more just like you're saying, is having a mechanism to assess the security of your suppliers, to
Right.
have, a way to actually evaluate the security practices that they have,
Right.
or even just have a benchmark. So to be, certified or accredited to a certain standard like SOC 2 or ISO 27001, these produce a lot of assurances for those companies. And not to say that certification frameworks are a silver bullet,
Right.
none of them are. It's more just having the right controls and testing your defenses, making sure that you don't just have a plan for an incident response, you actually test it,
Yeah,
tabletop it,
absolutely.
make sure that it works.
Yeah, makes sense. I wanted you guys to and ladies to meet your hacker. This is Ramon Abbas, commonly known as Hush Puppy. He is your Nigerian prince, the person that used to send emails out saying, his uncle has left $1 million and he needs to transfer it out of whatever country. And many people fell victim to this. I mean, there were he was targeting an English football club. He targeted U.S. law firms, right? This was a big deal, and eventually he was caught by the Dubai police in 2020, and then had an extradition to United States. But he ran this as an organization, like that's his Rolls Royce, that's his private jet. He was at the head of this organization, and his people actually had sales quotas, and they, he ran it like
That's
a
crazy.
proper, well-oiled sales organization.
Yeah, and if you do Google search on Yahoo Boys, you'll see kind of what Nigeria is up against. They have, this, it's almost like a lot of the youth in Nigeria, if they don't find a career path, they end up just kind of going to the other side, where they end
Right.
up, sitting in some of these, they're actually like houses with tens of people in there, where all they do day in, day out is they just defraud people. And I wish I was kidding, but they're actually sleeping on hundreds of millions of dollars in some of these houses. Like, it's just
Crazy.
unreal. If you look at the pictures, and the Nigerian police will parade them through town, but the reality is that when they come knocking at your door, Nigerian police often, we've heard they've been paid off. They come to the door and you're like, okay, here's $100,000, just go away. I'll see you in a couple of months, right? So
Absolutely.
even what we've seen on our side is that the minute that the RCMP, so think about, hypothetically, you were defrauded of $1 million, you call the RCMP and you let them know what's happened. The minute they catch wind that it's Nigeria, they almost lose
That's it.
interest.
And like they don't want anything to do with it, basically. These are talented people. They know
Very.
technology. I wish there was a way where we can divert that talent into something good, where like all that skills shortage that we have in the industry, Kevin Mitnick being the number one example of it. I mean, he was a convicted hacker who now is reformed and started KnowBe4, right? He's the guy that actually started ransomware as a service back in the day, where he had an eBay style page where he would sell ransomwares to people, and now he runs a very successful security awareness training company. So I think it's just about opportunities and someone creatively thinking about how do we redirect this talent.